The chronicles of those bygone eras have a way of echoing through time. The ancient shrines were systematically pillaged, and the very lands themselves were left utterly ravaged. And when countless churchyards became soaked with the blood of the clergy, when valiant champions met their end, when wives and defenceless children were dragged away into the horrors of slavery, only then did Ireland truly grasp the grim reality that had washed upon its shores. Only then did she comprehend the full, terrifying magnitude of the Vikings' wrath. They first materialised in 795, a mere 2 years after their initial incursions into England. Relentlessly, their fleets harassed Ireland year after year, and with each passing season, these Norsemen grew more audacious, more brazen in their actions. In due course, they would establish permanent settlements along the vulnerable coasts and waterways. Dublin, once a sparsely populated area, evolved into a fortified and thriving centre of Viking power within Ireland, forging crucial connections between the Irish shores and the wider world through a flourishing trade in goods, priceless treasures, and, tragically, human slaves. These burgeoning colonies were further reinforced by the arrival of Scandinavian royalty, very likely including the notorious Ivar the Boneless, who proceeded to establish their own ruling dynasties. However, sustained Viking conquests extending beyond the immediate coastal regions would prove to be an incredibly difficult undertaking. Anyone who dared to venture deeper inland would be trespassing upon the territories of over 100 petty kings and their fiercely independent clans. The Irish people primarily resided in what were known as ring forts, typically stone or earthen enclosures strategically positioned to overlook the surrounding farmland and pastures, which were usually dotted with livestock. The common people dressed in simple linens, secured with belts, and draped themselves in warm woolen cloaks, using the quality and craftsmanship of their brooches to subtly display their social status. Although this island nation had embraced Christianity since the transformative 5th century, thanks to the tireless efforts of St. Patrick, the Vikings certainly didn't bring war to a peaceful, saintly country. The clans of Ireland were perpetually engaged in plundering, raiding, and fierce infighting, all in the relentless pursuit of greater power. Thus, a Viking warrior society found itself thrust into the heart of an Irish warrior society. Vikings typically fought clad in sturdy helmets and various forms of armour, wielding spears, swords, and formidable great axes, while Irish men more commonly relied on the agile use of small shields, spears, swords, and darts, often forgoing heavy armour for increased mobility. While the Vikings ruthlessly slew their kings, pillaged their lands, and extracted heavy tributes, the embattled Irish forces struck back with such unwavering ferocity that the Vikings were eventually compelled to forge alliances and engage in complex political manoeuvring to survive. To this end, Viking leaders sometimes entered into strategic marriages with members of the Irish nobility, and some even converted to Christianity in attempts to gain favour and acceptance. However, currying favour with one clan inevitably meant incurring the deep-seated enmity of another, and volatile coalitions frequently rose up in opposition to the Norsemen, ousted from Dublin in the year 902. The Vikings then resumed their raids with unparalleled aggression, eventually recapturing Dublin and launching renewed wars against the neighbouring kingdoms. It was widely recounted that neither veneration, nor honour, nor any form of protection for God or for man was shown by this ferocious, pagan people. They relentlessly reduced the Irish to lives of servitude and slavery. Numerous were the blooming, lively women and the gentle youths whom they callously carried off into oppression and bondage across the vast green sea. Alas, infrequent were the bright and brilliant eyes that weren't suffused with tears and dimmed with grief and despair at the agonizing separation of son from father, daughter from mother, brother from brother, and relatives from their very race and tribe. The region of Munster, in particular, bore much of this bloodshed and devastation, and it was from there that rose the man called Brian Boru. The effusive histories of him would say, "Bad was the luck of the foreigners on the day when that youth was born." In truth, Brian's father was the chieftain of the Dalgicais clan, And as Brian may have been the youngest of 12 sons, their regional throne wasn't initially destined to pass to him. But these were dark and tumultuous times. Wars against rival clans and against the relentless Vikings claimed the lives of his father and many of his siblings. It eventually came to pass that his brother, Mathgamain, assumed the throne and struck a truce with the Vikings. Brian, as later accounts told, would have none of it. By day and night, he relentlessly hunted the Vikings, sleeping on the damp ground, embracing the wild, exchanging kill for kill, until the number of his loyal followers had dwindled to a mere 15 warriors. The weary Brian then boldly reproached his brother for making peace when their forebears would have undoubtedly chosen war. Mathgamain, in the Council of Chiefs, heeded his words. In 967, they met their Viking enemies in a great, decisive battle, breaking and beheading the fleeing Vikings until they reached the Viking town of Limerick. If Brian was brave and wise, he was certainly not known for being merciful. The fort in the good town they reduced to a cloud of smoke and red fire. Afterwards, the whole of the captives were gathered on the hills. Everyone among them that was fit for war was killed without hesitation, and everyone that was fit for a slave was immediately enslaved. Victory had decisively proven their strength. Brian's brother reigned as king over all of Munster, but in 976, old rivals captured and brutally executed Mathgamain. Whispers and echoes of the ancient world stubbornly survived in Ireland. Although the pagan kings of yore were buried deep in earth and legend, their hallowed bloodlines were claimed by countless would-be kings, and old mounds, sacred woods, and standing stones remained objects of veneration and reverence. So it was that Brian ascended to the kingship of his clan, under the protective shade of their sacred tree, and with little delay, he gathered his forces. He launched a raid on a monastic island, slaughtering the Viking ruler of Limerick and his sons. He brought ruin upon his brother's killers, and forcefully reclaimed authority over Munster. But the swift rise of Brian Boru had undeniably drawn the attention of the powerful ruler of the southern Uí Néill, Mael Sechnaill Drai, in name, the High King of Ireland. Mael Sechnaill II had valiantly forced the Vikings of Dublin to submit to him back in 980. Now, he retaliated by raiding Brian's lands and uprooting the sacred Dal Gcais tree. No doubt utterly furious, Brian sustained a grinding war with this new nemesis for years, all while continuing to subdue the surrounding lands. He would even harness the fleets of subject Vikings to carry his marauding armies deep into Mael Sechnaill's territory. And in 997, after over a decade of bitter animosity, the two kings finally made peace. It was agreed that Mael Sechnaill would retain rule of the north, and Brian Boru would be king over the south. It was perhaps this dramatic shift in overlordship that stirred Sitric Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, into open rebellion. Along with the province of Leinster, the might of Dublin had long remained dormant under Mael Sechnaill. Now was a golden opportunity to test this Brian Boru of Munster. The king answered decisively. In the closing days of 999, Brian Boru and his new ally, Mael Sechnaill, marched relentlessly toward Dublin. The Dublin Norse and the men of Leinster sallied out to confront them at the great, pitched battle of Glen Mama. The armies fought with dauntless courage, and the hills were soon painted with gruesome carnage. Hundreds fell to the victorious spears and swords of Brian's men. Brian then did to the Vikings as they had historically done to his people. His army spent the first days of the year 1000 burning and plundering Dublin, its rich markets, and its vast stores of stolen treasures. The army captured so many of the Vikings' women and children that a later record exaggerated that the Irish no longer laboured at all, for all their farms were diligently worked and meals prepared by these foreign slaves. In reality, Brian dealt pragmatically with these Vikings. When Sitric submitted to him, Brian allowed him to return to the throne of Dublin. Many of these so-called foreigners were gradually assimilating into a Norse-Irish people. Sitric was, in fact, the son of Brian's wife, or former wife. From her previous marriage with the late Viking king of Dublin, Brian now secured the loyalty of his new subject by marrying off one of his daughters from another marriage to Sitric, effectively making the rebellious Viking his son-in-law. All the great Viking ports of Ireland now answered directly to Brian, becoming vital hubs of commerce that provided him with immense wealth. Fine ships and skilled warriors, certain of his own strength and now at the height of his power, Brian contested the rule of Mael Secnel in the north. The latter attempted to mount some resistance, but ultimately conceded, so it was that Brian Boru became the High King of Ireland. The aging king made great journeys across his entire realm, securing the formal submission of recalcitrant kings and courting the favour of Armagh, the influential church said to have been founded by St. Patrick. There, a cleric bestowed upon Brian the prestigious title Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Gaels. His high kingship ushered in a period of relative peace. He busied himself building great forts and round towers and actively patronising churches. But the vaulting ambitions of subject dynasties meant that there was nearly always some defiant lord in revolt. Catastrophe struck in 1013 when Dublin and Leinster again rebelled. Mael Secnel aided Brian and marched to pacify Dublin, but some of his forces, including his son, were slaughtered by Sitric. Sitric then aggressively recruited Vikings from overseas to challenge Brian. Earls and warriors from the Orkneys and the Isle of Man sailed into Dublin Bay. Some of these men had likely aided in the Danish conquest and brief rule of England months earlier. And in 1014, the Grey King Brian, variously recorded between the ages of 73 and 88, mustered an army several thousand strong, with aid from a distant edge of the Gaelic world, an Earl of northeast Scotland. Over the spring, they ravaged rebellious lands on the path to Dublin. Later histories frame the coming battle as a last stand for the very fate of Ireland. Such overstatement notwithstanding, the threat of a revived, autonomous Viking Dublin with foreign backing was, without a doubt, grave. On the morning of Good Friday, Brian beheld his enemy arrayed across a wide plain. They spread far and wide, their Norse shields, mail and helmets, glinting ominously in the rising sun. Later accounts of the battle have it that the army of Brian, led by his son Murchad, met the initial charge of the Leinster forces, and the Viking flanks quickly closed in. It was poetically told that in these roaring, agonizing hours spent hacking and stabbing, men were so drenched in blood as to be unrecognizable even to their own kin. Their spears became heavy with the hair of butchered enemies. Brian's son Murchad perished. But as the day darkened and the fallen lay in the thousands, the enemy fell back, some wading to their Viking ships drifting away in the tide, only to tragically drown when victory was near. A band of Vikings launched a desperate assault on the king's position. An Icelandic saga tells an elaborate tale that it was the Viking Brodir who beheaded Brian, and that the king's guard quickly avenged their leader. Wulf the Quarrelsome supposedly cut open Brodir's belly and led him round and round the trunk of a tree, and so wound all his entrails out of him. Whatever the truth of that specific day, it was abundantly clear that Leinster and the Vikings were thoroughly beaten, and the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, was no more. So ended the Battle of Clontarf, widely hailed as Brian's great victory and, ultimately, his sacrifice. The death of the king's heir left the dynasty in disarray to his other sons. Some records show that Mael Secnel regained the title of High King, but his authority would never again be so great as Brian's. Sitric, meanwhile, continued to rule in Dublin. The Norse settlements of Ireland remained important centres of trade for many years to come, but their power had been increasingly curtailed and harnessed by the Irish. For the subjugation of the Viking invaders and their descendants was not Brian's achievement alone, but that of many generations of Irish kings and warriors who stubbornly refused to yield. Stories of rising conquerors are undeniably compelling, and I think that's why I find Warhammer 40, Norse, Tacticus so engaging. You're thrown headfirst into the grim, dark future of the Warhammer 40, 00 Galaxy. It's your task to conquer the battlefields using tactical, fast-paced gameplay, all right there in the palm of your hand. You build your army by collecting and leading over 60 legendary Warhammer 40 0 champions from 15 playable factions. I also really appreciate how engaged and passionate the player base is. Over 3.5 million people have already joined the Tacticus battles, and you can join that player base anytime, from anywhere, in fast-paced PvE campaigns, tightly competitive PvP battles, and collaborative boss fights under your guild banner. The game also features the super fun Adeptus Mechanicus faction, whose attacks combine arcane weaponry and mechanical cybernetic augmentations, with new modes and content frequently added. Tacticus is an ever-growing, quality tactical challenge, and it's completely free to play. Please download from the link in the description and start conquering the battlefields of the far future.